That was the 5th. And the morning of the 6th began the counterattack of the Russians. All over the front, not only against us.
For over 80 years, the disappearance of an entire Soviet division in Finland's icy wilderness has remained one of the most chilling mysteries of war. Thousands of soldiers vanished almost overnight, their bodies frozen in eerie silence, their weapons untouched. Beneath the snow lies proof of a force no one can fully explain, a secret buried by both sides for generations. And as the frozen ground begins to shift once more, the darkness that consumed the 44th Division seems ready to rise again. Stalin's frozen gamble. In late 1939, the world watched as Joseph Stalin made a move that would test the limits of both men and machines. Confident in his army's strength, he ordered a massive invasion of Finland. Over 400,000 Soviet soldiers were sent across the border, expecting a quick and easy triumph. On paper, it looked like a mismatch. Finland was a small country with a tiny army, while the Soviet Union was one of the largest military powers on Earth. Stalin believed brute force would be enough to crush resistance and secure Finland's northern territories, protecting the vital city of Leningrad from any future Western attack. But reality was cruel. The Red Army entered a world unlike anything they had prepared for. The land was frozen solid, the forests endless, and the temperatures dropped to a deadly 40 degrees below zero. Their thin wool uniforms were useless against the cold. Soldiers who stopped moving froze where they stood. Trucks refused to start, rifles jammed, and food supplies turned to ice. What was meant to be a show of Soviet might quickly turned into a nightmare of frostbite, confusion, and death. Among the units thrown into this frozen hell was the 44th Rifle Division, led by Colonel Alexei Vinogradov. He was a capable officer, but even his experience could not prepare him for what lay ahead. The division, numbering between 13,000 and 17,000 men, was ordered to move along a narrow, snow-choked path known as the Raate Road. This lonely stretch of road cut through deep forests and open marshland, surrounded by waist-deep snow. Progress was painfully slow. The men trudged forward in silence, their breath freezing in the air, their faces hidden behind frost. The supply lines stretched thin, trucks sank into drifts, and horses collapsed from exhaustion. Some soldiers whispered that they were being punished by the land itself. One man later recalled wondering aloud why they were even there, fighting a people who seemed to vanish into the woods like ghosts. On the other side, the Finnish defenders of the 9th Division, commanded by Jalmar Siilasvuo, watched and waited. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they knew the terrain like the backs of their hands. They wore white camouflage that made them blend perfectly into the snow, and they moved swiftly on skis, striking like shadows before disappearing into the forest again. They did not plan to meet the Soviets head-on. Instead, they aimed to trap them, slice them apart, and make the land itself their deadliest weapon. As the 44th Rifle Division continued deeper into the wilderness, the sense of unease grew. The snow muffled every sound, the forest pressed close, and the light faded early each day. Even the most seasoned officers began to feel that something unseen was watching them. The Red Army had come to conquer a country, but it was the cold and the silence that ruled here. And on the frozen Raate Road ahead, something far more terrifying than Finnish ski troops was waiting to strike. Let's now take you into the White Abyss. The men of the 44th Rifle Division pressed forward into the White Abyss, their breath misting in the freezing air as they followed the winding Raate Road toward the village of Suomussalmi. Their mission was to rescue the nearby 163rd Rifle Division, already surrounded by Finnish forces. It seemed simple on the maps spread across the command tents back in Soviet headquarters, but on the ground, the path ahead was a death trap waiting to be sprung. The Raate Road was little more than a narrow trail carved through dense forests, lined with towering pine trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The snow lay thick and heavy, swallowing boots and wheels alike. The Soviet column stretched for miles, trucks, sleds, artillery pieces, and thousands of men trudging single file through waist-deep drifts. Vehicles stalled, horses struggled, and the biting wind screamed through the trees. The road offered no cover, no room to maneuver, and no safety. For the Finns, this was the perfect battleground. They moved like shadows through the forest, invisible in their white snowsuits. They knew every frozen creek, every bend, every ridge, using a tactic they called Matti. They began slicing the Soviet column into isolated pockets, surrounding and destroying them piece by piece. The word modi came from the Finnish term for a stack of firewood, and the meaning was cruelly fitting. Each trapped Soviet group became a pile waiting to be burned. The 44th, despite its mechanization, was hopelessly unprepared for such a fight. They had no ski troops, and their tanks and trucks were almost useless in the deep snow. Radios failed as batteries froze solid, and attempts to repair engines were futile in the cold. Soldiers huddled together for warmth at night, their fingers blackening with frostbite. Ammunition froze inside their rifles, and even the simplest tasks became impossible as the temperature dropped to lethal levels. When the first attacks came, they were sudden and terrifying. Finnish snipers picked off officers, then disappeared without a trace. Grenades exploded beneath stalled trucks, lighting up the night sky. Convoys were ambushed from both sides of the road, the flames of burning fuel tanks reflecting off the snow. Panic spread quickly through the Soviet ranks as men realized they were trapped. Every time they tried to regroup, the forest seemed to come alive with unknown enemies. As the days dragged on, the suffering grew unbearable. Colonel Vinogradov sent reports to his superiors, warning that his troops were exhausted, starving, and unfit for combat. But Moscow ignored him. Orders were orders, and retreat was not an option. By now, the once proud division had become a ghost army, crawling through an endless winter. Every sound, the crunch of snow, the whisper of wind, felt like a warning. Somewhere beyond the blizzard, Finnish troops were tightening their noose, and when the Soviet advance finally stumbled to a halt, the destruction that followed would not come only from battle. Something far colder, deeper, and far more merciless than bullets was waiting in the snow. The silent furnace. By early January 1940, the 44th Rifle Division had become little more than a broken line of men and machines buried beneath the snow. Trapped near Haukala, just 12 kilometers from Suomussalmi, the once mighty force of nearly 14,000 soldiers was now immobilized, starving, and freezing to death in the heart of Finland's winter wilderness. The Red Army's grand advance had turned into a slow, silent collapse. By the time it was over, the scale of the disaster stunned even the Soviet leadership. Official reports listed 1,001 dead, 1,430 wounded, and 2,243 missing from the 44th's strength of 13,962 men. But Finnish estimates told a grimmer story. Up to 9,000 killed, their bodies scattered across the snow, the frozen landscape littered with abandoned rifles, twisted vehicles, and shattered field kitchens. The defeat was total, and the consequences were swift. Colonel Alexei Vinogradov, who had led his men through this nightmare, was arrested along with his chief of staff and political officer. The Soviet command needed someone to blame. On January 11, 1940, all three were executed by firing squad, accused of incompetence and cowardice. But those who survived knew that no human command could have saved them. The land itself had turned against them, and the winter had shown no mercy. When Finnish patrols later combed through the battlefield, they found something chilling. The snow-covered wreckage told a story that didn't entirely make sense. Some bodies were positioned in strange formations, as if the men had frozen mid-action, their faces locked in silent terror. Equipment was abandoned in ways that defied logic. Rifles neatly stacked, rations untouched, vehicles still running until they ran out of fuel. The carnage of the 44th Rifle Division was horrifying enough, but among the remains, there were signs of something deeper, something that couldn't be explained by frostbite or fear alone. The frozen silence seemed to hide a secret of its own, one that would haunt those who dared to look closer. Whispers in the snow. When the fighting finally stopped, the Raute Road fell silent. Finnish patrols moved cautiously through the endless white, their skis gliding over snow that now covered the bodies of thousands. What they found defied all logic. Tanks stood abandoned with their hatches open, trucks still half buried in drifts, engines faintly warm as if their drivers had vanished only moments before. Soldiers sat slumped against their vehicles, frozen in eerie stillness, rifles resting beside them, untouched. Boxes of ammunition and food lay scattered, unopened, while field kitchens stood intact with pots frozen mid-boil. It was as if an invisible hand had swept through and stopped time itself. For days, the Finns explored the desolate trail, moving from wreckage to wreckage. The air was heavy with a strange stillness. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move. The The woods surrounding the road, once alive with battle cries and gunfire, had fallen into an unnatural quiet. Yet sometimes at night, sentries reported faint sounds, footsteps crunching in the snow, whispers that came from nowhere, and shadows that moved against the frozen moonlight. Compasses spun wildly for no reason, and soldiers swore the temperature dropped suddenly in patches of air so cold it burned the skin. At first, these stories were dismissed as exhaustion or imagination born from war. But then, more disturbing signs appeared. Some Finnish units discovered trails of footprints that led deep into the forest, ending abruptly, as if the people who made them had simply vanished. In other places, weapons were found arranged in strange, deliberate patterns. The survivors who stumbled across these scenes felt an unshakable sense that something was deeply wrong. Later, accounts emerged from Ukrainian veterans who had served in the 44th Division. They spoke of the final chaotic retreat through the forests, men running blindly, desperate to escape the unseen terror that seemed to close in from all sides. Many who tried to flee never returned. Some were found much later, miles from the road, their tracks circling aimlessly before ending at empty clearings. Others disappeared completely, leaving behind only their weapons and gear. Those who somehow made it back to Soviet lines were met not with relief, but suspicion. NKVD officers executed dozens of returning soldiers, branding them deserters or spies. Their stories, filled with panic and mystery, were buried along with them. Official Soviet reports painted a very different picture. They blamed the defeat on enemy action and freezing, carefully avoiding mention of anything unusual. The documents made no reference to the missing men, the warm engines without drivers, or the strange silence that lingered over the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Finns quietly recorded the enormous spoils of war. Hundreds of captured vehicles, mountains of rifles, and piles of equipment left behind, as if the Soviet army had simply ceased to exist. But decades later, when modern investigators returned to the site, they would uncover traces that hinted at something even darker, something that could not be explained by war, weather, or human fear alone. Mass graves and hidden truths. The Finns began the grim work of gathering the dead. Mass graves were dug along the Raate road, the ground so hard it had to be broken with explosives. Men worked in silence, their faces pale beneath the endless winter sky. But soon, something strange became clear. Many of the bodies showed no signs of battle. Some had died from exposure, their skin marked by frostbite rather than gunfire. Others appeared to have simply collapsed where they stood, eyes open, faces twisted in confusion or terror. Identification was often impossible. Dog tags were missing or frozen to the flesh. The scale of the loss was staggering, and the questions multiplied. Finnish officers noted how many soldiers seemed to have died far from any fighting, deep in the woods, with no bullet wounds and no sign of struggle. It was as if they had been overtaken by something unseen, an enemy far colder and quieter than any human foe. Even stranger were the reports of bodies found in odd positions, some kneeling as if praying, others sitting upright in rows, their rifles lined neatly beside them. The Soviet Union showed little interest in recovering its fallen. A few official requests were made, but no major operation ever came. The frozen soldiers remained where they fell, covered by drifting snow and silence. Finnish historians later pointed out that the Soviet side made no serious attempt to collect the remains or even identify the missing. It was as though Moscow wanted to erase the memory of the 44th entirely, to pretend the division had never existed. Years later, researchers sifting through Finnish military archives noticed peculiar inconsistencies in the wartime records. Some units reported more bodies found than official Soviet lists recorded missing. Others mentioned soldiers discovered without weapons or gear, suggesting they had abandoned everything before death. Even the logistical numbers didn't add up. Trucks and tanks counted on Finnish recovery lists had no matching entries in Soviet inventories. Something was wrong, and the deeper the historians looked, the stranger it became. Whispers began to circulate among those who studied the battle. What had truly happened in the final hours of the 44th Division? Why had so many men perished without fighting back? And what could explain the eerie patterns found among the dead? As the snow melted that spring, Finnish engineers working to clear the wreckage stumbled upon something unexpected beneath the ice-packed soil. It was metallic, buried deep, and far larger than any weapon they knew. Its surface gave off an odd shimmer, as if untouched by rust or decay. Some called it a fragment of machinery. Others weren't so sure. And beneath that snow-covered forest road, the traces of an object, or perhaps a device, waited silently, holding the secret of why the 44th Division had vanished so completely. The obscured device. In the years that followed the Winter War, the story of the 44th Rifle Division faded into the shadows of Soviet history. Official records reduced it to a simple military failure, a blunder explained away by cold, exhaustion, and Finnish ambushes. But when the Soviet Union collapsed decades later and long-sealed archives began to open, fragments of a deeper story emerged, one that suggested the truth was far stranger than anyone had imagined. Among the newly released files was a report from January 1940. It revealed that the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had quietly formed a commission to investigate the destruction of the 44th Division. That alone was unusual. Entire divisions had been wiped out before without such scrutiny. But what the documents described went far beyond the typical explanations of poor planning or harsh weather. The commission gathered testimonies from engineers, radio operators, and surviving officers. They spoke of sudden, simultaneous electrical failures across the entire column. Tank engines stalled as if drained of power, and radios went dead at the same moment, leaving thousands of men cut off from command. Some reports included data from field sensors that had registered strange electrical spikes in the area shortly before the collapse. These readings didn't match any known atmospheric or magnetic patterns. The official summary marked them as anomalous interference and buried the evidence deep within classified archives. Survivor accounts added to the mystery. Ukrainian veterans who had served with the 44th told stories that sounded less like battlefield memories and more like encounters with something unexplainable. They recalled hearing a low, steady hum in the forest at night, a sound that vibrated through the ground and made their teeth ache. Some men claimed to see movements between the trees, figures that seemed to shift with the snowlight but never left tracks. Others described the feeling of being watched, not by enemy eyes, but by something larger and unseen. When they tried to report these incidents, officers dismissed them as hallucinations brought on by cold and fear. Yet nearly all the surviving soldiers remembered the same sound, the same strange stillness that fell before the attacks. Even Finnish terrain experts who studied the battlefield years later were puzzled. The placement of the destroyed vehicles and the pattern of ambushes along the Raite road looked unnaturally precise. It was as if the entire division had been herded into a perfect grid of traps, each choke point lined up with unnerving accuracy. Some suggested that Finnish scouts had simply planned their strategy brilliantly, but others suspected that something had interfered with Soviet movement in a way no human could have engineered. Then, in 2024, a Finnish-led research expedition returned to the site armed with modern technology and ground-penetrating scanners. They hoped to document the last remains of the battlefield before time erased it completely. What they found buried beneath the ice was not just the wreckage of war. It was something older, hidden, and pulsing faintly in the silence of the snow. The truth finally surfaces. In the spring of 2024, the Raat Road was no longer a forgotten relic of war. It had become the focus of one of the most secretive scientific investigations in Europe. A Finnish-led research team arrived armed with technology that the soldiers of 1940 could never have imagined. Using ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic detectors, and high-resolution satellite imagery, they began mapping the frozen soil where the 44th Rifle Division had met its grim fate. At first, the data showed what they expected: debris fields, collapsed trenches, and scattered remnants of long-buried vehicles. But then the instruments picked up something else, something that didn't belong. Beneath the surface, just beyond the ruins of the old Soviet command post, the scanners revealed geometric voids perfectly symmetrical in shape. These weren't natural formations. The readings suggested man-made structures, or perhaps something far older, hidden deep beneath the permafrost. Even more unsettling were the heat anomalies. Despite sub-zero temperatures, the instruments detected faint warmth radiating from one of the buried shapes. When the team focused on it, they saw what looked like a smooth, metallic orb embedded in the ice, The object seemed impossibly well preserved, its surface gleaming in reflected light, even under layers of frozen soil. It wasn't rusted like tank fragments or scattered ammunition. When electromagnetic sensors were brought near it, they registered a low, pulsing signal, steady, rhythmic, and unnatural. The energy emissions were weak, but constant, as though something deep inside the object was still alive. When soil samples were taken from the area around it, the scientists were even more alarmed. The earth near the orb showed clear signs of thermal alteration. Sand melted into glass-like formations and traces of chemical fusion never before recorded in natural settings. Whatever had produced that kind of heat had done so without fire or explosion. The surface patterns looked eerily similar to reports from meteorite impacts and radiation burns, yet neither explanation fit. The Finnish government quickly sealed the excavation site, citing environmental safety and national heritage protection. But word still leaked. Independent researchers and journalists began piecing together what they could from the fragments of data. According to one leaked internal memo, the readings suggested a low-frequency emission inconsistent with known military technology, historical or modern. Another noted the exact location of the orb, mere meters from where the Soviet command post once stood, as if the 44th had unknowingly camped above it before being destroyed. Historians began to reconsider the events of 1940. Perhaps the annihilation of the 44th wasn't only a story of military failure and freezing weather. Perhaps the Finnish ambushes, brutal as they were, had merely accelerated what something else had already begun. A new theory emerged that the mysterious object, whatever its origin, had somehow interfered with the division's machinery, disrupted communication, and triggered the collapse. It may have exploited the very chaos the Soviets created. What do you think really happened beneath the frozen forests of Finland? Could the mysterious orb hold the key to the 44th's fate, or something far more dangerous? Share your thoughts in the comments below.